Kia ora koutou katoa. I begin by acknowledging the people and ancestors of Rangitane, whose land and wisdom form the spaces in which we have these conversations here at CARE. I'm really excited to introduce this series on the futures of the culture-centered approach at CARE, and particularly excited to welcome our friend, collaborator, colleague, Professor Shaunak Sastry into this conversation. Professor Shaunak Sastry is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Cincinnati, and he's also the director of the Cincinnati Project, which is a research center that innovates in community-engaged and community-embedded research and practice in the College of Arts and Sciences at UC. In 2024-2025, Professor Sastry is also the Provostal Fellow for Community-Engaged Research at UC. So we will have a lot to hear from Professor Sastry on community engagement and how that connects to the CCA. Professor Sastry serves as the chair of the Research Council of the National Communication Association. And in that role, he has really played a key part in initiating various kinds of transformations at the NCA. What I remember the most about Shaunak is the work that we did together under the Communities and Universities Addressing Health Disparities project at Purdue University, which was a 3-year project addressing health inequities experienced by African Americans, and particularly heart health inequities. And what were some of the critical lessons learned in those conversations, particularly about the role of the academe in its relationship with community, the nature of the culture-centered approach in addressing the upstream structural determinants of health, have formed some of the key anchors to the work that we do here at CARE. Shaunak is a critical thinker, one who has played an active role in pushing the boundaries of the conversations on the CCA, and that I think will be reflected in this conversation. And he has widely published this work in a range of outlets, including top disciplinary journals such as Human Communication Research, Communication Theory, and of course, Health Communication and Journal of Health Communication. As a senior editor in health communication, he played a critical role in creating openings and nurturing spaces for conversations on the culture-centered approach in health communication. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Shaunak, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan, and thank you everyone at CARE for allowing this conversation to happen. And special thank you to Dr. Datta for that really generous introduction. It's always sort of surreal to hear, kind of a mentor kind of do these kind of introductions. It's in some ways, Mohan has been instrumental in my journey as a CCA scholar. So I'm very, very humbled by that, Mohan. Thank you for doing that. My talk today is titled "Building, Extending, and Evaluating CCA: Insights from a Metatheoretical Systematic Review." And the talk, even though I am sort of credited as the sole speaker, really comes from 2 places. One, the idea that CCA, like Mohan very articulately expressed, has always been a scholarship of the collective. In some ways, this tradition of scholarship rejects this idea of the sole author, researcher creating these scholarship in a vacuum. But even in more sort of pragmatic ways, this work, the talk today, really emerges out of a collaborative article that I published with my colleagues, whose names are on the slide right now: Megan Stevenson, Dr. Patrick Dillon, and Dr. Andrew Carter. So before I start my talk, I just want to kind of talk about how this article that we published in Communication Theory came to be. this really was one of those cases where, at that point, my student, Megan Stevenson, and I were, like we do, discussing CCA and sort of we were in the process of reading the core texts, thinking about the major theoretical components, and as is very often the case, I was rediscovering the CCA through my interactions with them. And then I found out at a conference that another duo, similar student and mentor, student and professor, Dr. Carter and Dr. Dillon, were doing a similar kind of journey. They were thinking about how to categorize and understand and evaluate CCA. And so we got together. We talked about whether it would be feasible or productive for us to join forces, as it were. And we did, and I'm so glad we did that, because we are all richer for the experience. So the combined effort that led to this piece, which is published in Communication Theory, as I mentioned, in 2019, has been, to our knowledge, the first systematic evaluation of this hugely influential turn in health communication scholarship. Very recently, and this is really sort of humbling and an honor for me and for us, was that the piece was recently declared as the winner of the 2024 Distinguished Article in Health Communication Award, that is given by the National Communication Association's Health Communication Division. This award is meant to honor articles that have been published 5 years before and have kind of had time to have an impact and on the field. And so it was a great sort of honor to us to hear that our piece made the cut. So what we're going to do, what the article tries to do, and kind of what my lecture is going to depart from, is to really think about the uptake of the CCA, right? For scholars who are familiar with the culture-centered approach, we know that it is, at least in the field of communication, the most identifiable and formalized, critically oriented approach to health communication. It forms the basis, a large bulk of the health communication research that is critically oriented, in some way has connections to the CCA. When I say critically oriented here, I'm referring very clearly to a tradition or a set of traditions in health communication that are explicitly interested in the question of power and inequity and attribution of illness. So while a lot of health communication theories recognize that health disparities exist, recognize that there are power inequities between the haves and the have-nots, recognize that illnesses and diseases can disproportionately impact some groups over the others, critical health communication at its core thinks about the relationship between large, broad structures, social structures, institutional structures, political structures, and health outcomes of individuals and communities. So, because the CCA has been such a prominent theoretical approach in shaping the contours of critical health communication, it was a bit surprising, or it was time for a systematic evaluation of how the theory is being taken up in the field, how the central tenets are cast and recast, how does the use of CCA terminology in data collection, in analysis, how do the central concepts of CCA get used in the field. This piece is, or this lecture is really kind of based on the idea that as scholars and practitioners of CCA, we all have this anecdotal experience or sense that the term culture-centered approach has certain kind of discursive appeal, right? When we meet interlocutors at academic conferences or even at practitioner contexts at NGOs, that people understand the term, the culture-centered approach, but they very often mean very different things from it. right? Even though it has, like I say on the slide, a wide range of interpretive purchase, it is being used in the field to several, often disparate scholarly, political, and activist ends. The interest, I think, for CCA at where it is at currently, from the initial writings of Dr. Mohan Datta and Dr. Basu and the first wave of CCA scholars, is to really examine where we have come this far, and then where can we go ahead from this point, right? And so, as a critically oriented theoretical approach, CCA has a very specific set of theoretical, political, methodological, and value-based commitments. However, it is not a prescriptive theory in the sense that like a functionalist theory would be. It is less of an orthodox theory as much as it is an assemblage of metatheoretical commitments about how one engages ethically with communities at the margins, right? It has a particular telos, a particular value orientation over what is the role of academics with privilege and access to discursive spaces, to social spaces, to capital, to policy. How does one relate to communities that one speaks for and speaks to? So, what we attempted to do in this piece is to systematically evaluate the CCA. For the purpose of this lecture, I will review the paper briefly, but will not get into real depth, because I want to talk about the insights, which I think are more relevant for this audience. So, just as a bird's eye view, we use the Prisma categories to identify all academic literature that sort of met a particular set of eligibility criteria, right? So, what kind of culture center scholarship was being published in peer reviewed journals? What kind of scholarship provided empirical reports on human subjects data? And we had several other exclusion and inclusion criteria. Our sample sort of our date range started from Jan 2005, which is when the earliest CCA scholarship first was published, and to May 2018. I kind of reflect on how long it has been since we even ended data collection, because I think so much has happened in the field from 2019 to now, and not least of which was a pandemic, right? So anyway, so if for the folks interested in our evaluation criteria, all of this is available at great depth in our paper. So I will refer you to that for the specific procedures. But sort of to cut a long story short, in the end, we ended up with a corpus of 47 studies that we could use in our analysis. And so what we did is we collected demographic and substantive data for each article in each study. And we used reliability measures to ensure that we were coding the same thing. There was intercoded reliability, and we sort of report on that in the piece as well. What we were looking to study is not the results of the studies that used the CCA, but rather how different scholars and academics were using the CCA. In other words, we were theorizing about how the theory was used, right? So, which is why meta theory. We were interested in how does the theory get taken up by scholars. And so we identified the key theoretical concepts, the constructs in CCA, like, for instance, a culture, structure, agency matrix, the concept of dialogic co-construction, secondary concepts like voice, dialogue, localized sense making, context, space, and so on. In order to create some semblance of a common playing field, we operationalized some of these measures in a sort of quantitative value by having both a quantitative 0 to 2 scale of how each construct was operationalized, and also buttress that with qualitative sentence descriptors. And we have, again, a lot of these measures are reported in the paper. The next couple of slides just give you a snapshot of the studies that were included in our corpus. This again is very amply and in detail referenced in our piece. So I want to get to the key insights or what we found from this large systematic study of how the culture-centered approach is being used and how it is being operationalized across various health contexts. And I will provide for today's talk three basic insights that eventually led us to conceptualize a modification or a development of how we present the CCA, how CCA can be not just translated but also communicated in terms of its core principles. The first insight that I want to talk about is the idea of CCA's intrinsic heuristic value. And as might be obvious to those familiar with the culture-centered approach, that for a large preponderance of those using CCA, its value or its heuristic appeal lied in the fact that its ontological axis, that CCA theorizes health in ways that is very helpful for scholars working in critical cultural health communication contexts, right? So on the slide, I kind of summarize our findings here, that our conceptual descriptors in the CCA, which I will get to in the next slide, have great heuristic value and they are widely used, but the theory's explicit political commitments are not always self-evident in the way both the theory presents itself, but also how they are taken up. What do I mean by this? So we know that at the crux of the CCA, when scholars and academics and students first come to the CCA for expanding the repertoire or out of interest, or when they're recommended to do CCA work, their immediate sort of reflex attention goes to this tripartite ontological structure, that in the CCA, health or the role of communication in health is understood as a dialectic between culture, structure, and agency. And I'll give a quick overview here because I think these are fairly self-evident. But in the CCA, health is understood as being at the nexus of these three constructs. Culture, referring to sort of local meaning-making practices that are dynamic, that are in flux, that are constantly changing in response to larger institutional forces, institutional constraints that either promote health or restrict health, right? Which is the structural construct. And the third crucial construct in this tripartite arrangement is that of agency, is of individual ability or individual motivation to be an agent, right? And so to understand how health operates, what health means, one necessarily needs to look at the intersection of cultural practices of health, structural constraints and enablers, and individual agency and its ability to enact health. What we found in our analysis was that most studies that use CCA used some variant of this triad, right? This was the most common way in which people understood CCA, that it provides a heuristic categorical framework. Some used it in terms of as sense-making constructs, right? So when they used it, for instance, some studies used it as ways in which to categorize data, ways in which to categorize how local community members spoke about health in a post hoc fashion, right? Some used it as a priori kind of organizing frameworks. But for a large extent, this was prevalent in how CCA was used, that CCA largely meant culture, structure, agency. And there are good reasons for this. This model is really clear. It is really parsimonious. It provides a really what Clifford Geertz would call allows for thick description of health behavior, right? This tripartite was widely employed in the literature. However, and I think this is the key sort of next step, for a lot of the scholarship that we analyzed, CCA ended at describing health arrangements within this framework, to be followed up then by a myriad of behavioral or cultural or social modifications recommended either by um, academic experts or by community members themselves, right? And so I think what one of the great um, insights for CCA scholarship going forward is what happens to CCA outside of this descriptive parsimony, this descriptive richness. Yes, it provides us with this language, and for a lot of people who are not trained in the CCA tradition, they come to the theory for this um, um, really accessible categorization. But what else exists? And so I will refer to this back when I talk about our refined model. How does one go beyond this descriptive elegance to thinking about the political and the activist goals of the theory? The second insight was had to do with the question of participation. If we see CCA as a mechanism to build participatory health communication um, mechanisms or infrastructures, very often the way this was taken up and the way scholars understood co-construction or dialogic co-construction was the idea of co-defining the problem. There are good reasons for this as well. There is a plethora of research in anthropology, in medical anthropology, in sociology, in communication about how defining the problem and defining the problem locally in ways that are congruent to local cultural formations is the first step in gaining trust, in developing a relationship that endures. Arthur Kleinman 50 years ago talked about the 8 questions to ask a patient about illness, right? What do they call it? How do they deal with it? So on and so forth. I think what CCA does and the real kind of value of the theory is to think beyond problem definition. Very often, and these are a pragmatic a pragmatic issue that a lot of scholars face, is that they are not um, at a situation or in the position to engage in detailed problem definition work with the communities that they are working with. In other words, the problem already has been defined either by representatives of a marginalized group, by representatives of a dominant group, by an institutional structure, or by a third party. But just the fact that a problem has been defined a priori does not preclude the possibilities of engaging in radical redefining work. And that's kind of the insight that we developed from the scholarship, that even though the gold standard of CCA would be that to understand the health practices of a marginalized group, you really ought to start with how the problem is being defined locally. Problem definition may be maybe the gold standard, but very often researchers come into the problem at the interpretation stage, right? So not just defining the problem, but creating the scaffolding or the infrastructure in which to then decode the problem in ways that are congruent with how local community members decode the problem or how they talk about the problem, right? And so what we saw and what we offer is that in its sort of epistemological leg, when CCA was being used in determining what is key knowledge for marginalized community members, we saw a spectrum of positions, right? There where one could theoretically start at the point of problem definition, right? Where the problem could be defined a priori. It could emerge from interactions with the community. This is sort of that this is the work done by Basu and Datta, the work done in at the Kalighat Sex Worker Collective. It's the work done in places where the health problem really emerges organically as a response to structural constraints. But this is not the only way, or this is not necessarily the most common way in which CCA is taken up. Right? Very often, CCA scholars can really open the door for doing transformational work at the level of interpretation. How does one interpret a health problem, a local community articulation, in a way that opens the doors for dialogue and co-construction? A great example here is the thinking about reframing health problems in order to mobilize certain kinds of activist structures, right? So in my own work, thinking that sought to reframe HIV/AIDS and the HIV/AIDS epidemic in India as a problem of as an occupational hazard, not a cultural perversion, or not a problem of illiteracy. That it was the occupational conditions that structured the risk to HIV. Right. So the interpretation work can provide interesting opportunities for linking certain health contexts to resources. And then finally, what we refer to as "quote unquote" the Goldilocks zone of CCA, right, which is the idea of full participation, or participation, an idealized state where community members own health interventions, where researchers become literal co-creators and co-participants in the journey, right? Um, in my own personal experience, a lot of scholars that have the initiative and the desire and the drive to work with marginalized communities are paralyzed because of the fear of never reaching this idealized stage, of never or not knowing the roadmap to this sort of this model, right? And that paralysis very often kind of gets in the way of actually doing the work that is possible or that is pragmatic. And so we talk in the paper about how do we see this as a perhaps as a stage problem, not as a it is either this or not this, right? So it is not a 1-0 sum game, but that participation is a layered, tiered, staged process. Finally, the third insight, and I think this is the most sort of methodological or philosophical insight, I think, among how the theory was used. And this took all of us on a journey, the authors of the paper, on a journey of how we understood the CCA and what we meant by it. There's a lot of discussion in CCA about reflexivity being a tool, not just for researchers, but for researchers and community members together. Reflexivity being an ethical commitment, reflexivity being a hallmark of CCA scholarship that is accountable to itself, is accountable to the community. But very often when we refer to CCA, to reflexivity in CCA, or at least when scholars refer to reflexivity in the corpus, it dawned upon us that they were referring to two related but separate processes. And to elucidate this, we kind of tore apart this idea of reflexivity into what we now call methodological reflexivity and philosophical reflexivity. in the on the slide, my summary statement says self-reflexivity goes beyond research positionality in the CCA, because we very rightfully worry a lot about positionality, about one's um, um, identity, and how that shapes our interactions with marginalized community members, and how one's um, uh, embodied presence shapes those interactions. But that self-reflexivity is um, only one aspect of what we mean by it. Self-reflexivity in CCA is also linked to its emancipatory telos, and by that I mean that these 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 that there are two senses of the term reflexivity, and I kind of define them, and I think these are taken from the paper. When I say methodological reflexivity, this is reflexivity that is a tool for good qualitative ethnographic research. This is the approach to data collection and data analysis that ensures that one is transparent about one's values, that one is um, aware that our individual life experiences, our worldviews, our ideologies are reflected in the choices we make. And so in this case, methodological reflexivity refers to the universe of strategies, actions, orientations, and decisions made by researchers to build validity, to build robustness into their data, right? This is done to acknowledge the complex terrains of qualitative research, where our interpretations can impact how data fidelity. Methodological reflexivity then is reflexivity to ensure that we are actually capturing what is being said, that we are aware that our representation of an interaction with a community member or with a cultural participant has as much to do with us as it has with them. And reflexivity and methodological reflexivity is a way to keep our interpretations in check. It is operationalized through ethnographic field notes, through reflexive journals, through member checks. That is sort of what we call the baseline of reflexivity. It is methodological. It is in the interest of ensuring that one's interactions are ethical, are robust. But in the CCA, there is another level of reflexivity, and which is sort of reflexivity of the political commitments of the theory itself. That engaging in CCA is not just an exercise in categorization and nomenclature. It is not the championing of culture like it is a variable, but that the theory has a particular political commitment of the role of academics, of the role of the academic partner, the role of solidarity with marginalized communities, that the commitment to the theory is built in to the politics of the CCA. Very often amongst um, uh, sort of the in-group of CCA scholars, we call this the politics of the CCA, right? Like, are you being accountable to the idea that health communication and dominant modes of health communication often are responsible or participate in the oppression of marginalized communities, right? And so there is this dual layer. One of the things that we found out, or we concluded upon, based on these three insights: the ontological insight of CCA being of heuristic value, of having a particular draw, the epistemological value of dialogic co-construction being a continuum, and then the axiological angle of CCA thinking about reflexivity in two distinct ways. What that led us to think about was that, to an outsider or to someone who has not engaged with CCA for an extended duration, or who is someone that is just reading scholarship, CCA scholarship, right, from a sort of secondary vantage point, that these complexities of CCA may not be apparent in the way that we talk about it, the way we use it, the way we describe it. And so one of the things that the piece really tries to do is to think about a new metaphor or a new visual argument or an analogy for thinking about CCA. The piece aims towards what we call the nested dolls model, right? We call it the nested model in the paper to be sound more academic, but really, the more we thought of this, we really arrived at this figure of the quote unquote Russian doll and the nested doll, right? Where each of the individual components of the set of dolls is by itself sufficient, but you only understand um, the value or the ubiquity of the model when you understand that they exist in nested formations, that they only make sense within a particular kind of nesting. So the complexity and commitment to transformation that is inherent to the CCA is most apparent when we see the model as a combination, a nested combination of these components, even though individual components may be sufficient. And so, what we ended up doing in this piece is thinking about CCA as or at least refining the way in which we think about the visual representation of the model, right? So, from our understanding, whenever and this is also my understanding, when I see CCA scholarship that's produced in the journals, or as editor of a journal, one of the editors of the journal Health Communication, very often I will see the innermost circle, the CA, the Culture Structure Agency Triad, as a reference to CCA. That's kind of that's what it means. That's the heuristic value of the theory. But what we miss out by just referring to this is that there are other components to the CCA. I want to be clear. What we are arguing is not for an orthodoxy of how the theory should be used. Rather, we want to open the possibility for folks to think about what these components mean individually and together. So in essence, then what we're asking from the way we extend or the way we want to kind of represent the model is to think about different tiers of doing CCA work. On the top of the figure, you will see it says tier 1, problem definition. Maybe the place where one starts doing culture-centered work in partnership with local communities is to do definition work, to do interpretation work, to do the work of problem definition, right? Which as I outlined, goes from an a priority to an emergent spectrum. But beyond that, one can start thinking about uh, going from definition to interpretation to participation as a spectrum, as a set of stages that one takes on in their relationship with communities. And this model allows us to look at the three sort of axes or the three nesting components of the model, right? The ontological, what is health? To understand health, one has to look at the interaction between culture, structure, and agency. How does one look at it? Epistemology, how does one know what one knows? Through problem definition, through interpretation, and also what are the values that go in the pursuit of that knowledge? What is the kind of reflexivity that is required of the work? What is the reflexivity towards the politics of CCA, towards making uh, um, the inherent agency of subaltern communities, of marginalized communities, at par with academic theorizing? And so that journey allows for us to represent the data better. Like I said before, the point of this is not to create some sort of artificial line in the sand about what is real CCA and what is not. Rather, it provides an opportunity for folks to enter CCA at different places. And what we noticed in our corpus is that very often there are scholars who are doing bits and parts of this in their own journeys, that they are interested in problem attribution, they're interested in interpretation, they are thinking more clearly about politics, about philosophical reflexivity, right? And the beauty and the value of the CCA is that it allows us to do all of these things together. Um, I And so the kind of the large argument of representing and kind of moving the theory forward instead of the 20 years or the 30 years that we have now seeing its development, is to think about how do we provide a tool that is useful to a variety of users, or a variety of scholars and practitioners. So our sort of overall objective was to broaden the field, or to broaden the range and number of scholars who could make sense of CCA and use it to what their academic or activist goals were. Um, I want to talk a little bit as I kind of come to the end of the talk about, I've been thinking about CCA now as a scholar who is, I mean, I guess I go by a senior scholar in the field now, but my journey with CCA began as a graduate student. So I've really gone through uh, layers of an academic career, sitting with these ideas and using them, right? Um, and I think it is interesting to me that CCA today is in a very different field, a different cultural moment, a different social moment than it was when uh, Dr. Datta and his colleagues first articulated it, right? I think it's also time for us to, as CCA scholars, to reflect on the life cycle of academic theories in terms of what's the next step for CCA now? What can we say about the social context in which the CCA has evolved? At what life stage is it? Is it a young upstart? Is it now is it reaching middle age? Is it reaching stability and renewal? Where is it in its kind of journey? One of the relevant factors for this conversation is the fact that the field of communication looks very different today than it did when the CCA first sort of emerged as a revolutionary way of doing health communication. Concepts like voice, agency, marginalization, and representation have been mainstreamed in the discipline, and to no small extent because of the impact of CCA. Correct. But there is a contradiction here, though. Even though we are arguably at a quote unquote social justice turn in the field, some of the most critical concepts in CCA, in post-colonial theory, in post-structural theory, have been thoroughly co-opted and sort of recolonized in the global North and South, right? So the idea of voice, for instance, or the idea of decolonization, the idea of agency. I mean, it has been used to the most regressive, to the most parochial ends in the context of large-scale health inequities, both in the global South and global North. And so in the face of that, as critical scholars, our task is always incomplete in terms of how does the theory then keep its sharp critical edge honed. And that question is a question that we all need to engage with at a theoretical but also practical kind of level. For certain in the field, there are calls now in organizational communication and in other fields, in other subdisciplines of our field, to return to the material as if we have been away. But this newfound interest in materiality, in the material ways in which health shapes the difference between those who are healthy and those who are not, really kind of beseeches us to think more about how do we maintain the critical edge in a post-pandemic world, right? So the kind of final point that I want to leave with today, and this is something that I have personally been theoretically kind of really struggling with, is to think about agency and how agency is valorized in the CCA, and how does that relate to the information landscapes in which we find ourselves in within infodemics and within sort of mass what one could call mass delusional behavior in terms of masking during the epidemic, or during sort of vaccine denial and that sort of kind of behavior. Thinking about individual agency in ways that offer a more perhaps guarded or more structuralist um, interpretation of agency is perhaps where the theory needs to go. So that's really most of the my uh, argument for this piece. When we wrote this, it was like I said, it was 2019. Much has changed in the field, and but yet CCA remains today to be a dominant way in which folks understand critical cultural health communication. The question for us is to see how far we have come, like I said, but also how do we maintain this critical edge going forward. Thank you.
Kiora, thank you so much, Shaunak. That was a brilliant walk through the life cycle of the CCA, if you will, and you delineate some really key points about the ontology, epistemology, and axiology of the CCA. If it is okay, I want to sort of push you and also think through with you, some of those aspects. And let's begin by talking about the culture, structure, agency
Mm,
triad. As you rightly pointed out, the pandemic brings forth perhaps uh, scenarios or empirical um, accounts that invite us to critically think through the notion of agency and connect it to structure.
mm,
At the same time, one might argue that the kinds of enactments of agency you saw amidst the pandemic,
mm,
including things such as resisting um, masking,
mm,
for instance,
mm,
right,
mm.
is always sort of in relationship with structure,
Yeah,
in the sense that particular forms of expressions of agency are intertwined with
right,
structure. So if
right.
you think about some of the earliest work with the CC, when I was working with Santalis,
Mm,
and one of the themes in that line of work is the resistance to biomedicine,
mhm.
particularly in terms of the resistance to, vaccination drives, for
Right,
instance,
right,
right?
right.
Um, and so in terms of those practices of expression of agency, even theorized as micro practices of resistance
Mm,
to these systems of organizing hegemonic
right,
structures,
right.
um, how do those differ from, or what are the convergences and divergences between those expressions of
That's
agency
right.
and, say, for instance, resistance to masking?
Asking, right. And so, and this is such a, this is the question, right? This is the because it is almost as if there is a need for a new or a different vocabulary or a register for thinking about behaviors that functionally could be labeled to be congruent or corollary, right, Mohan? So, for instance, um, the resistance to biomedicine, the resistance to um, tests, to lab tests or to X-rays, and we've seen that in various contexts, and not in just in the context of indigenous movements in India, but also among. I mean, there's medical skepticism and vaccine skepticism and all of that, right? Um, I think the challenge for CCA and the thing that I really struggle with is to think about how does one then differentiate um, between the co-optation of this language for what is a political end, right, or for what is uh, uh, in some ways masquerading as sort of a grassroots challenge, right? So this is basically astroturfing, what you would call in social movement literature, right? This is it carries all the it looks like indigenous resistance, but it is actually organized very clearly towards certain aims. And so I don't know if there is, and but what I can see is that at this point we don't have the theory doesn't doesn't allow us. We have not sharpened that gap and kind of said, look, here is the point. Here the same um, the, there is always a possibility of co-optation of the inherent struggle of agency, right? And so that, how does one then clarify that in the context of where is this co-optation and where is this just a mass hysteria or whatever, right? And you see this question reappears over and over in various different health contexts, right? And this is certainly what we found in our sort of other work on engaging communities for COVID vaccination, right? It's the same sort of genre. um, I don't know if there is a particular articulation in the CCA yet about at least acknowledging or recognizing that these can be used to very different political ends, and I think that's perhaps where the intervention lies, to even recognize that, look, no, yeah, agency is always constituted in relationship to structure, but how we decide that, how that is configured, is always a dialectical process.
Beautiful. And I suppose, part of that also is like what you were referring to in terms of, say, particular kinds of regressive political movements co-opting
That's correct.
agency, or
That's exactly right.
authoritarian populist movements co-opting agency.
That's exactly right.
I see that very much as part of the agency culture, structure, dialectic, particularly, and that interplay,
Right.
particularly in terms of how, I suppose, structures tend to co-opt agency in order to
That's exactly right.
further perpetuate
That's exactly right.
these structures. There is a piece that Phoebe and I published in Communication Monographs, which
Mhm.
is came out in 2023, and that is out of our work in Glen Innes, which is predominantly um, people of color
Mhm.
neighborhood, Maori, Pacifica in Auckland, largely housing projects with urban development actually expelling out many communities from these spaces of livelihood. In
Mhm.
that backdrop, what you have in Glen Innes is sort of this the Christian organization that sort of um, has played a key role. So Brian Tamaki, if you Google it, you would find sort of this movement that serves these communities at the margins, primarily low-income communities, but also um, communities of color,
Mhm.
uh, but with messages based upon misinformation
Right.
and the
Right.
continual work
Yeah.
of othering.
Yeah.
So in that piece, we argue that the context for the misinformation is actually the structure, but it is not just the organizing of this sort of a populist right-wing
Mhm.
structure
Yeah.
that peddles the disinformation and hate,
Right.
but it is also the organizing of the neoliberal structure
That's correct.
and the ways in which health services are mediated and delivered,
Certainly.
such that for in another piece in MCQ, we point out that for those communities at the margins, um, the dominant services that are seen as the progressive services don't really appeal
Right.
because of the various layers of stigmatization and sort of dehumanization, if you
Right.
will,
Right.
that play out. So within that context, places like Destiny's Church, which
Mhm.
is the organization I was referring to,
Mhm.
or gangs become positive resources for community to find that support, care, and
Right.
nurturing.
Right.
And then it is within that context when you look at misinformation, or what we label as misinformation, it takes up a very different character.
Right.
So I suppose, Shaunak, it's also an interesting question in terms of what you rightly point out, how we unpack the question of agency and structure. But I suppose, going back to your question of philosophical reflexivity
Mm,
that you were talking about in
mm.
method, is the question of what kind of structural
Right,
transformation would we really like
right.
to see,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. And what that looks like in that particular context,
Yeah.
right? Like what it looks like in that particular this is, I mean, this is kind of the whole conversation is reminding me of this discourse of engaging communities of color to get COVID vaccines, right? Like this is this kind of refrain in U.S. public health discourse, like the only way to, yes, this is a sort of biomedically safe or effective or efficacious intervention, and but there is this widespread mistrust. What does one do? But oh, let's turn to community engagement because only communities can convince each other to take it. But there is no reference to what that means in terms of power, into what that means in terms of controlling the narrative, what that means in it's literally a glorified focus grouping of messaging, not fundamentally changing the structure of like where you get your information from, who gets to control that information, who gets to filter it. And so you're right. um, the question of what are the possibilities in that particular context, sometimes that is just a matter of like saying, this is like it takes an outside perspective to be like, you could just do this and being okay with it. Sometimes I find in academic context, sometimes like the desire for sophistication is very we can come up with something which is not theoretically sophisticated, but it is helpful, or someone has defined it as helpful, but it's not, that's not seen as being enough, right?
And part of this, and I go back to that vaccine question
Mm.
and the sort of the earliest sort of interventions with the CCA, which is in some ways I worry that we reproduce the same hegemonic um, forms of marginalizing, to the extent that this language of misinformation once again is deployed, now albeit under the name of culture,
Right.
to mark communities
That's
at the
correct.
margins as in deficit, and then to target them
That's right.
with culturally appropriate or culturally sensitive
Right. And
messages. And somehow this move is presented as the progressive move, and it gets lumped together with the move against Trumpism and
right.
the Bannon Trump disinformation ecosystem, blah, blah,
Right.
blah, while being
Yeah.
entirely critical of the complicity of this system in reproducing
That's right.
capital and
That's right. And but
yeah.
also in reproducing the same kind of violence that came with like with vaccine denial, or like systematic abuse of vaccine trials, right? Like, I mean, there's, yeah, you're right. Um, I I mean, if you just think about, I mean, I'm working on this long sort of monograph on thinking about sort of COVID governance in India, China, and the US, and I'm constantly thinking about how the political kind of need boxes that we have in each of these places don't really fit in if you think about the ways in which sort of these dominant ideologies reproduce, right? So like US state funded anti-Chinese vaccine propaganda in China versus like sort of the rhetoric from the sort of Chinese authorities, and so yes, the question of specificity is really becomes important in this case.
So
Mm.
I will build that to sort of the next question, because we are moving into the domain of praxis, Shaunak. And I suppose the question for praxis from an academic sense um, is one of if you're committed to addressing those upstream structural determinants of health. So let's go back to that
Yeah,
vaccine example. Um, and once you start unpacking that, so let's take indigenous health as an example. And once you start unpacking that, what do you come um, to grapple with, or you come face to face with, is this idea that to actually address these structural determinants of health, we need for land to be returned to
Right.
indigenous people.
Right.
You know,
Right.
because so once you start working
Right.
through those
Mm.
upstream
Right.
spaces,
Right.
it brings you to some core areas
That's
where
correct.
it then turns your um, method and your praxis into um, forms that are necessarily resistive in a
Mm.
way that
Mm.
academics to actually be in struggle or with
Mm.
struggle, right? So I guess, but then, you and I have talked about this, that different academics will come into this at different points of the journey, and that journey will take different forms as well. But if we sort of are moving toward that upstream, I guess the question from your piece is that if you were going to teach this piece to students, and you're creating an invitational space to invite them in, how do you at the same time hold it with that promise that it's CCA, its appeal is the heuristic, and it is this appeal to a politics of struggle.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Um, and, and I don't know if I have a good answer to that, Mohan. For me, um, the fact that at some point this becomes about, not about a particular kind of message or context, or it becomes a very different kind of advocacy. And and I have seen, we all know academics who are advocates in ways that they recognize that it's no longer about what they are doing. In the end, now this has become about reparations, or it becomes about um, land, or it becomes about these kind of you know like colonial structures or whatever, um, neoliberal reforms, land reforms, you name it. Um, I don't know if there is a way to say to tell someone, look, this is what's going to happen down the road, and so maybe you will and maybe you won't, right? But uh, that I think the journey for me through CCA has been the recognition that if I had not gone through the journey, I would not have seen that personally in my academic journey or in other people's. Like I would not have seen that at some point this is no longer about this one thing, but it is, it goes to a broader structural configuration. My my kind of anecdotal and sort of personal experiences, it's almost flipped, where I would find like young scholars being like, I'm not an activist, I'm not going to go and do this work, I'm not trained to do this work, but I really care about these people. What do I do? Do I just not do it? Do I, do I just? And so, yeah, there is consciousness raising, maybe there is, and but it's such an organic journey. I don't know if there is a component that is didactic in the model, that
Mm,
that comes with some really, like, some of the most people who I know who are I think what I would call radical work are like doctors who work like and who are doing this work that is like, it's it is trying to transform that. They're not critical social scientists, they're not worried about discourse and representation. But they understand that they are in this moment where they're in this structure. So for me, that journey is really organic, and it's in some ways it is the narrative of that individual person. I mean, in a collective, and this is why I said it's the scholarship of the collective. In a collective, you sort of learn from each other, and you kind of grow from each other, and you recognize that when you bite structure, structure bites back, right? You kind of recognize that when you learn from each other's experiences. Um, but I'm not sure everybody has that luxury, or everybody kind of lives in that space.
and perhaps that's where there is room for collective pedagogy
Yeah,
in that sense,
yeah,
right? In terms
yeah,
of what does it take
yeah,
to
yeah,
actually sustain and develop sustain communicative practices of
Right.
advocacy
You know,
that challenge these structures.
so one of the things that I found myself doing is that even though when I'm interlocuting with non-communication people, or like with medical um, colleagues, I would like tone down the CCA aspect of my work and kind of be like, oh, this is kind of whatever, cultural determinants of health. And then in this one case where we were submitting this large grant, and I'm not going to mention that because it's under review right now, so I should not jeopardize it, I guess. But I went away from that, so I kind of really leaned into the CCA and talked about it in great, like I would be talking to a colleague, to a group of um, folks who knew the tradition, right, who understood the concepts, understood the vocabulary. And I was really surprised that it is one of the strongest feedback came from, well, why was this not applied to other parts of the thing, right? Like, oh, this clearly makes sense, da, da, da. And so that's the real, you recognize that you kind of self-censor in some ways also, right? We feel like, oh, this is too radical for these people to deal with or whatever. But that's also an education. So the challenge for me has been that this has been, I feel like it's a really organic kind of journey of figuring out where that lies. But
And in this sense, I'm really glad you bring this up, because as a meta theory CCA, in some ways, the way I envision this the space is that it has to be transdisciplinary. It has to, you talk about the collective. It has to work in that broader sense with diverse intellectual and knowledge traditions to actually reimagine what those transformations are, right? So when we work with migrant construction workers in Singapore, and they talk about housing, and then co-constructing with them a blueprint for what ethical, sustainable, just housing for migrant workers looks like, I found that actually we need to work with civil engineers
right,
and architects,
exactly.
and um, you know
Yeah, yeah,
to
it's not.
actually start building these frameworks.
Yeah, yeah. Our only tool cannot be the tools that we have, right? Like that's just
Yes.
it's a particularly like sort of isolating way of looking at it.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
one last question,
Sure.
Shaunak, and this question is about you sort of laid out this question about where CCA is in its life cycle, right? And that's quite a profound question, because I think it relates to you know the question of where one situates the meta theory in relationship to the field, in relationship to the politics of building space,
Mhm.
vis-a-vis the space that has been built, and the politics of reflexivity and what that actually means, and perhaps what openings for renewal look like.
Right.
So I guess I turn back to you and I ask, where do you see CCA? And connected to that, then what are the kinds of critical futures you envision for it, given where you place it?
That's a big question, Mohan. I don't know if I have a very satisfactory answer to it, but um, I'll just say a couple of things. One, I feel that sometimes I feel that CCA conversations are more productive when I'm talking to folks who are not in the field. There is a inside outside aspect to CCA, which is interesting, even though uh, uh, um, I think for due to the advocacy and work of a lot of us in the collective, we have kind of created space for CCA in the field. But um, sometimes the best interlocutors for it are actually outside of communication. But that's sort of a bureaucratic answer rather than a where it's going. You know, I think, and this is kind of the question then becomes uh, one of ownership as to who, like, who will shake it up in a way that uh, or rethink blind spots that you are not seeing, that the first generation, like the scholars who are trained in this tradition are not seeing. And I I place myself firmly in that sort of old guard. So I don't know, but I know that there is. So I have like young scholars um, who will like say, who will like question about ask good questions about, how does this, what is the connection to this outcome or that outcome, or to structural change in this way or that way. Um, I've been kind of mulling over what sort of this local culture means, right? Specifically in the context, I mean, just thinking about responses to COVID, right? Like that's been kind of where I've been thinking about CCA, I think, and how simultaneously how relevant, but also how irrelevant it kind of became after the pandemic. How it just, like local cultural practices, um, and how we define that. So I think there is there is going to be or there is bound to be shakeups in how new or younger scholars want to define it. I don't know whether you and I, or all of us who kind of cradle it like a child, are ready for it. I don't know if we are ready for that. I'm not ready for it in the sense that I don't know if I can prognosticate in ways that are objective or enough.
That's a beautiful way to wrap this up, Shaunak. And I think, what it does is creates an invitational space for us to actually uh, uh, even imagine what these dialogues will look like.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. Once an advisor, always an advisor. I didn't know there was going to be like question and answer session after my lecture. So always kept on my toes. So that's good. I really appreciate it that I had to kind of think on my feet a little bit there, which I'm not used to. But thank you, Mohan.
Thanks, Shaunak.